In September of 1522, the German reformer Martin Luther published one of the most important books in history. It was his translation of the New Testament into German. Actually, it was the first time that the New Testament had been translated from the original language, that is the Greek, that it was originally written in the New Testament, into a modern language. And all this happens in a very difficult time in Europe in the 16th century. The Nordic Bible Museum wants to mark the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's New Testament, published in September of 1522, also called the September Testament. We are very glad that you are with us today to mark these 500 years. So welcome to this special two-part webinar, Luther New Testament 500 years. I'm going to start with part 1, and then Paul Espen is going to go in with part 2. Luther New Testament 500 years, and part 1. We're going to discuss these 3 main points. First, who was Martin Luther? We need to focus on some important moments in his life, some notable events, and to understand what motivated Martin Luther to translate the Bible into German. Second, we're going to see the historic context in which he is translating the Bible into German. And third, we're going to focus on which source text did he use to translate the September Testament, the New Testament that he published in September of 1522. So this is what we have in part 1. In part 2, Paul Espen is going to see more about the work behind the translation of the September Testament and also the Old Bible and the language he had translated in. Some decisions he took, some examples, and also the influence and the impact this translation had in Europe in the 16th century. So let us begin with part 1. Who was Martin Luther? Maybe you have heard about this man, Martin Luther, and you connect this man with the Reformation. But he did many things in his life that maybe you don't know of. He was born in 1483. He comes from a working family. His father, Hans Luther, was a miner of some standing who wanted the best education for his son, Martin Luther. He wanted that his son got to the university and be a lawyer, to study law. And he understood that his son needed to master the Latin language. So Martin Luther enters a Latin school in 1490 when he was only 7 years old. That's why he mastered it so well, because he had learned Latin at so young age. In this timeline, we're going to focus some important events of Martin Luther's life and what motivated him to translate the Bible. So his father wanted his son to be a lawyer, so he went into university in Erfurt in 1501, and in 1505 he graduated with a Master of Arts. That was to prepare him to further study law. But something happened in that year, 1505, in the 2nd of July of 1505. When he went to visit his parents, something happened that day, because there were a heavy storm with thunder, and Luther, he thought that he will die that day. So he promises that if he survives, he's going to be a monk. Yes, you heard it right. He promises to be a monk if he survives. And what happened? He survived. And 2 weeks later, he enters the monastery in Erfurt to be a monk, to start his monastic life in this monastery. And he entered the Catholic order, a very strict order called the Order of Augustinian. This was not good news for his father. He was not glad about this decision, but this was the decision of Martin Luther, and he enters the monastery in effort to be a monk. That was his decision, and he did it. And some years later, 1507, he is ordained as a Catholic priest. So life-changing, from one career to be a lawyer to another to be a theologian or a monk, religious man. Something else happened in his life that changed his mind and his life when he traveled to Rome. He was sent with another companion of him to Rome as a representative of the the monastery in Germany, and they went to Rome. They have been sent to Rome to deal with some issues there. And before he went to Rome, he thought that Rome was the holy of holies. He thought that Rome, that the church was the best. It was the most spiritual city in the world. So when he went there, as he has written in his writing, he explains in his writings what he thought were when he went there. He explains that he got very disappointed. Why? Because he saw injustice, he saw immorality, and also abuse of power, not from the people, but from the clergy. So he was very disappointed. So when he got back to Germany, he struggled with himself and against the church. He didn't understand many things, and he almost lost his faith in God. But after some study, especially in the book of Psalms and also Romans and Hebrews and Galatians, he gets an understanding. As he understood the text, he saw that God was merciful, and that according to Romans chapter 3, he understood a doctrine that he developed in some time, justification by faith alone. But he was very critical against the church, especially against the sale of indulgences. And he wrote something, and he had lectures and sermons against this practice, and that motivated him especially to write the 95 Theses, because at that time you could buy a document that said that your sins had been forgiven by the church, by the Pope, authority of the church, but not only for your sins, but also for your dead family sins, and that your time in purgatory could be reduced. Well, according to Catholic doctrine, there is heaven, there is hell, but there also is the intermediate state called purgatory, according to Catholic doctrine. At that time, with this document, indulgence, you could buy with money forgiveness of your sins and reduce the time in that state. So many people did buy this document because they want the best for their family. So when Martin Luther heard about this practice, especially when he heard that Rome used the money from the sale of indulgences in building the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, that was enough for him. He didn't like it at all, and that motivated him to write these 95 Theses against the sale of indulgences. And that he did in the 31st of October of 1517. He wrote this 95 Theses in Latin. That is important to note. He wrote it in Latin. Why? Because he wanted an open discussion with the intellectuals who knew Latin, and he wrote it. And the historians are a little bit in doubt here, and there are some debates, because everybody knows that he wrote these 95 Theses, but there are some doubts who put that 95 Theses at the door of the church in Wittenberg. But that's not the important point. The important thing is that that 95 Theses was written in Latin, but someone saw this in Latin and translated it into German, went to the printing press, and then published it and distributed it all over Germany. And what happens? The reaction of the people against the church. So that was not the intent at the beginning from Luther himself, but the reaction culminated in the Reformation, because many people was against the church. So there were many discussions between the church and Luther again in this critical thinking of Luther. The church wanted Luther to change his mind. He didn't. He negate to do this. He wanted to reform the church, and after some time, he had written many tracts and written texts against, not only against the indulgences practice, but also against the church itself, the Pope. So that culminated with many discussions, both in person and also in written form, that at the end, the church officially excommunicated Martin Luther in January of 1521. But that was the church decision and reaction. Now the church wanted the state to do the same against Luther. That's why there were many discussions, some weeks, what to do with Luther, and the emperor have some meetings in Worms, what to do with him. So they decided to invite Luther and to talk with him so he could change his mind and repent, you can say. But to do this story short, Luther came to Worms with a self-conduct that he received for 21 days. And the decision that the emperor took against Luther was that he was now a fugitive. He was condemned. But before that decision came from the emperor, he got kidnapped before the end of the safe conduct. So he was kidnapped and sent to the Wartburg Castle. Who was responsible for this? Frederick III, also called Frederick the Wise. So he wanted to protect Luther, and that's why he kidnapped Luther. So Luther went to Wartburg Castle, as we see here in this chart map. So the 95 Theses got some reaction, and that's culminated in the Diet of Worms. So he sheltered in Wartburg, and there he used the time to translate the New Testament in Wartburg Castle. He struggles at first because it was from May in 1521 he went to the castle, and then in December of that year he begins to translate the New Testament. In only 3 months, it says that he translated the New Testament into German. Why he did it? Well, he was maybe encouraged by others to do that. He had translate some portions of the New Testament into German before. He had lectured in many of the biblical books, and he had read the Bible in Latin many times, so he could many passages by memory. But now he wanted the people who couldn't Latin to get to know the message of the Bible in their own language. So that motivated him because of the Reformation also, and the people's reaction. He wanted the people to get access to these texts. So he did this work to the people so they could understand the text. And after some time, after some years, he completed with the help of others to translate the Bible, the whole Bible, and it was published in 1534. He got married in 1525 and got some children, and after some time, he struggled with health and with his health, and he died in 1546. So this is roughly the life of Luther as a translator. Difficult time in the 16th century. Now that we have some more knowledge of this man and what he did, let us see the next point, the historic context in which he is translating the New Testament. Before Luther's time, there were many different prohibitions of having the Bible in common language. For example, in the Council of Toulouse in 1229, there were a provision of having the Bible in common language. And some years later, this is in France, and then in Spain, Tarragona, the same provision came to have the Bible in the common language. So the only authorized Bible was the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate. But and there were many other translations before that, translating by hand in manuscripts form. But when Gutenberg, when the printing press was available in Germany, or not in Germany, but in Europe, it revolutionized all Europe at that time, the 16th century, on the 15th century, and then in the 16th century also. So that helped many authors and also translators of the Bible to distribute their text in many exemplars, many thousands of exemplars, so the people could get access to the Bible in their own language. But that was not an easy task. As a reference, we have the Spanish Inquisition in 1478. It begins, that has a lot of consequence in Spain especially. And then the Reformation. Many historians say that begins in 1517 with this 95 Theses. As we have explained, it was not the intent at the beginning of Luther to have a Reformation. He wanted an open discussion with the church itself, with the intellectual, but the reaction of the people got to a Reformation. It went further with the critical thinking of many people against the church. So if we go further from 1517 and on, we see the reaction of the church against Luther, and that motivated him to translate the New Testament at the beginning. But we see that in this time it was the church as an authority, but also the state, the emperor. They have monopoly of the people and also of the theology and the doctrine, and also the Bible translation. Only the Latin Bible was authorized by the church at that time. So now we understand that it was not easy to translate the Bible into a common language in so difficult period of that century. But he did translate the Bible into German in a difficult time. And when Luther died the same year, it came the official prohibition from the Catholic Church to have the Bible in the common language in the Council of Trent in 1546. This official prohibition came from the church. And the emperor, who was responsible for the Diet of Worms, the word diet means assembly or meeting. In that meeting of Worms, the emperor, who was also king of Spain, Charles I, known as king of Spain, and Charles V as the emperor of the Roman Empire, had been emperor from 1520, and he was responsible for the Diet edict, for the Diet of Worms against Luther. Well, we understand that it was a very difficult time in Europe at that time, but he translated the Bible against all odds. So now, we have been introduced to Martin Luther, his life, and also the historic context in which he translated the Bible into common language. Now let us see the source text he used to translate the New Testament, especially now the September Testament. Which source text did he use to translate the New Testament into German? That's what we are going to focus now in this third part, or third main point. Textual basis for the translation. Well, when Luther were at the Wartburg Castle, he had access, some historians tell us that he had access to some specifically edition of the Bible, of the New Testament. Many historians says that he had access to Erasmus' second edition of the New Testament, Greek Latin text, bilingual text, second edition of 1519. And some says that he had also access to a German Bible, the final Bible of 1475. Now, Luther wanted, his main goal wanted to go to the source text, as he explains in his writings. But we need to understand that he didn't master Greek so well as he did with the Latin language, because he mastered Latin. He had learned it from a young age. But he had begun to learn Greek, the Greek language, from 1518, especially from that year. He maybe could have or had learned some Greek before that time, but especially from 1518, when a professor came to Wittenberg and teach the Greek language in the university in Wittenberg, Philip Melanchthon. We're going back to this man after in a minute. But this was the source text. Maybe he also had access to a Latin Vulgate, and he did know his Bible by memory, many passages by memory in Latin. So that's that as a reference, we understand that he had access to Greek text and to Latin text, and he, as a translator, did a translation as he understand the text and interpreted the text, because every translator is an interpreter of a text, and a translator need sometimes to understand the text and to interpret it in the language he is translating. So maybe in some places the translator is taking some decisions to bring the message much clearer in the other language that he is translating to. So we're going to see some examples. Here we see a picture of the Wartburg Castle, very nice. It is possible to visit this castle today and see the place where Luther translated the New Testament in December of 1521 to March of 1522, in 3 months. But he didn't translate it alone. He did translate it alone when he was at Wartburg Castle, but before the text were sent to the printing press and published, he got the help of Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon was younger than Martin Luther, almost 14 years younger. And Philip Melanchthon was the professor in Wittenberg in Greek. He was an expert in Greek. He had written a Greek grammar. So from 1518, he was the professor in a Greek course, and Martin Luther enters this course to learn Greek. So now we understand that Martin Luther had some knowledge of Greek, but only in had studied it 4 years. So he was not, he didn't master it so well, so as, for example, Philip Melanchthon did. He was an expert. But Martin Luther had some knowledge of Greek, so that we know. But when he went from Wartburg Castle to Wittenberg in the beginning of March of 1522, we know that he got the help from Philip Melanchthon to revise the New Testament text that he had translated at Wartburg Castle and correct some errors before it went to print. But we also know that Philip Melanchthon encouraged him to translate the New Testament, because Luther said once, I quote, "Melanchthon persuaded me to translate the New Testament," end of quote. So we know from Martin Luther itself that he explains that Philip Melanchthon encouraged him to translate the Bible, the New Testament, at first into German, because Martin Luther knew German. He talked to people. He was interested in the common people. He could good German, but he could also Latin and a little bit of Greek. So we know that he knew and masters Latin and knew a little bit of Greek. Now, which language did he use to translate the New Testament into German? Well, let us see some examples. There are some debates about this issue. Some scholars have done some studies and take some sample of the gospel, and for example also the letter to the Galatians as an example, to make a study to see which text did Martin Luther use to translate into German. And there are different conclusions. Some say that he did rely on the Greek text, and sometimes in some passages he go to the Latin. Others says that no, he went as a source text, the Latin text, and sometimes he translated it from the Greek text. Well, we need to acknowledge something, as we are going to see an example here. We are going to see this example to better understand what he had access to. This is the Erasmus second edition of his New Testament in Greek and Latin from 1590. And as we see here, here is the Greek text of 1 John chapter 5, and also the Latin text beside in 2 columns. So he had access to both languages, as Erasmus had in his edition. Here is the Luther's New Testament edition, and here as a reference, the King James Version from 1611. So let us see here, what did he do here in 1 John 5, 7, 8. Here, as we can read it from the King James Version, it says the following, as the King James Version put it. For there are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and their 3 are one. This, and also the end, and their 3 agree in one, do not appear in Luther's translation. Why? Because we don't find it in Erasmus' text. We don't find it in the Latin nor in the Greek text. But why did King James Version had this text? Well, this is a very big topic, interesting textual history about these words. But as Erasmus explains in his annotations in this passage, he had some doubt about this text, this added word, as he says. In his first edition, Erasmus, and second edition, he don't use these words as he understands it, added words, because he explains in his annotations that some copies, later copies, did add these words in the text. He explains that in the annotations, Erasmus. But the third edition, in the third edition of Erasmus, in 1522 was published, he put these added words as we see in the King James Version. In heaven, the Father and the Word and the Holy Ghost, and there three are one. Why? Well, he explains why he did not put these extra words in the first or second edition of his text, because he didn't find some Greek manuscripts who had these texts on it. But then, before he published the third edition, it says that someone brings a manuscript written in Greek that had these extra words. So he put these words in his third edition. Well, that's why Luther did not use this extra word. And at that time, the Latin Vulgate had that extra words, as the manuscripts available at that time had this text in that way. But that explains that Martin Luther, he knew his Latin Vulgate very well, but he now relies on Erasmus' text. And maybe also by the influence of Philip Melanchthon, he decided to not add the other words in his September's Testament. So this is only to show you that Martin Luther relies on Erasmus' edition, second edition of 1590. That's why this text, these words do not find in his edition of 1522. Let us see another example. Translator or interpreter. And we see here, Martin Luther did make some decisions as a translator, and that's we see here in Romans 3:28. Here we have the Luther edition, 1522, Erasmus second edition, 1519, Latin and Greek text. And then we have as a reference, King James Version, 1611. Now, let us read as King James Version had it. It says here in verse 28, therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith, comma, without the deeds of the law. So here it says that a man is justified by faith, comma. But Luther added a word here in German. This word is in German allein. That means alone. So this added word alone, he added in his edition. But why did he do that? Have he some source text? Well, if we added this word into the King James Version, it says the following, that a man is justified by faith alone, comma, without the deeds of the law. So this word alone is significant in this text. But he explains later in an open letter why he did it. He says, because, before we explain that, in the Erasmus text, we don't find that word. We don't find it in the Latin nor in the Greek text, that word that he translated it or put it as alone here. But in an open letter published in 1530, he explains why he did this. Because he had a lot of critic. Many criticized him for this. So he explains that he did this because the German language forced this word to be here to understand more the meaning of this verse, he explains. But we know when we examine his writings that he had also some theological importance here, and also some conclusion he came in this passage, because he had developed this theology of justification by faith alone. So that's also a factor to take in mind. But this is a decision, and here we see the translator is being an interpreter of scripture. He interprets the text and puts some added words. That we see in many translations. So now we understand that Luther, Yes, he had access to the Greek text of Erasmus and also the Latin text, maybe use both, and he took also some decisions to interpret the text to convey some meaning as he understood it. Some interesting thing also we see in the index of the September Testament. Here we have the books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and in number orders up to 23. But then we have 4 other books separate: Hebrews, James, Judas, and Revelation, Apocalypse. But why did he put these books in another order? Well, he had some preface to all, introduction to all the books of the New Testament, and then before he begins with Hebrews, he explains why. Here we have a translation to English, and here he explains his views against Hebrew. This is the letter to the Hebrews is an anonymous letter. We don't have the name of the author, and he had doubts, and he did conclude that this is not an apostolic letter, so it has not the apostolic authority. That's why he couldn't rely fully on this letter. But he explains something very interesting at the end of this preface, as we read it here. Who wrote it is not known and will not be known for a while. It makes no difference. We should be satisfied with the doctrine that he bases so constantly on the Scripture, showing a right fine grasp upon the reading of the Scriptures and the proper way to deal with them. So he saw something good in this letter. That's why he also have some lectures on it and studied it. But it was not an apostolic letter. So he explains this also when he got to the other books, for example, James, the letter of James, he has some doubts, some contradiction as he's understood it. If he have written or read and studied the 2nd chapter of James and compare it with the 3rd chapter of Romans, he saw some contradictions there. So, and he did not see Jesus' focus. He did not see the Christology as he expected from the other books in the New Testament. So he did not see authority in these other books. Interesting thing to see what Martin Luther did with these books, and openly explains this in his September Testament. Well, that's what we have seen in part 1 of Luther New Testament 500 years. We have seen who was Martin Luther, what motivated him to translate the Bible into common language, and we have seen also that it was a difficult time in Europe at that time, in the 16th century. Before that time also, it was difficult because it was a prohibition to translate the Bible, and he did this task and work in a difficult time so that people could have access to the Bible. And we have also seen some examples that show that Luther was a translator of the Bible and also an interpreter, and that the source text was the Greek, but also the Latin, and he used both, but to get the Bible into the common language to the people. So now we're going to see the part 2 of this webinar, Luther New Testament 500 years.
Thank you, Alex. It's a very nice presentation you had. Let me see, I'll just get my presentation up. There is a little bit overlap in our presentations because there are so many ways you could go about this. There are so many angles to this. But I have tried, since this is a webinar that is from the Nordic Bible Museum, also try to bring out show you some of the treasures that we have in the museum, and it's and his collection that are very relevant and very central, in fact, to the topic at hand. I would like to start with the picking up from Alex for the foundations for the work. What made it possible for Luther to do this work? Because, as you know, it's not only about skills and competence and desire when people succeed with things, it also has to do with timing. And this was a special time, as Alex pointed out, with the Europe that was in turbulence, and with a relatively weak papal power, and with a relatively weak also powers in central power in Europe. So this made it possible, actually, for this to happen. And the art of printing made it also possible to spread Bibles, primarily in Latin, all over Europe. But as we will see, there was also a number of German Bibles before Luther's time. And at the time of the Reformation, there were also a number of new translations of the Bible from Hebrew into Latin, done by Reformed scholars. Knowledge of Greek, as Alex pointed out, was relatively new in Europe. It actually was initiated by the fall of Constantinople, just 5 years or so before the Gutenberg Bible, and spread knowledge of Greek over in Europe, and was a very important part of humanism. And this eventually led to Erasmus translating the New Testament from the Greek into Latin in 1516, presenting the Greek text along with his translation to prove that his translation was right as an alternative to the Vulgate renderings. And finally, there was also a growing knowledge of Hebrew, an interest for Hebrew among Christian scholars. Luther had some unique conditions in his personality and his knowledge. He had a great knowledge about the Latin Bible, the Vulgate. He knew a large part of it by heart. He also had a knowledge of German, in the sense that he came from an area of Germany, as we will see, that was in between the different extremes of the German language. And he had a background, like Alex said, his father was a miner, came from a small town, a lot of farmers, and he knew also how ordinary people spoke. But at the same time, he also was very well versed in academic language and theological language. As Alex referred to, he had also some knowledge about the source languages, Greek, and then also later Hebrew. But his expert knowledge was in Latin. It was, you can say he was fluent in that. It was like a mother tongue to him, like German. And this diverse background he had made him also have a knowledge of human nature. And last but not least, he had a very strong desire to bring out his understanding of the Bible, of the gospel, to ordinary people. And that was his strongest, but that was what fueled him into doing this translation work. And then he had some very skilled friends and a team around him. And last but not least, he had the opportunity, when he was at Wartburg in hiding as Junker Jörg, the peace and quiet to concentrate and be able to do the work of translating the New Testament in just 10, 11 weeks. So let us just take a time to look a little bit closer at a couple of these conditions. Yeah, as I said, you need a Vulgate Bible by heart, and this is a Bible from the museum collection. It's a 1497 edition of the Vulgate, and one of the very first with a very elaborate title page, as we can see here. Here also, Luther no doubt also had access to Bibles in German. Alex mentioned one edition. In fact, there were 18 pre-Luther Bibles in German. And they were all literally translated from the Latin Vulgate. So in fact, you needed to know Latin in order to be able to understand it really. It was more like a Latin German than German. The first of this was the Mentalin Bible of Strasbourg in 1466. That was actually the first Bible that was printed in a modern language other than Latin. And of these 18 Bibles, 14 were in High German. That is the German of the central southern Germany, and 4 were in Low German. That is German dialect from north of Germany. So here we can take a closer look at a beautiful Bible in the museum collection. It's a 1476 Sensenschmidt Bible, printed just about 20 years after Gutenberg at Nuremberg, one of the early centers for Bible printing in Germany. And this is the 5th version of the Bible in High German. Beautiful book. Alex already mentioned Philip Melanchthon. He's very important. Some say that it should have been called the Luther Melanchthon Bible. His name was not Melanchthon, really. That is the Latin version of his name. His name in German was Schwarzet, and he was a young friend, colleague of Luther, becoming a professor of Greek at the age of only 21. So he was like a wonder child, very gifted. So let's now turn to the September Testament 1522. What do we see and what do we not see? Well, we see the title, das Neue Testament Deutsch, and we see the place of printing, Wittenberg. But that is the only thing we see. We don't see the name of the translator. We don't see the name of the publisher, the printer, and we don't see the year, the printing year. Well, this was not actually so uncommon, because translating and printing Bibles in the 16th century was dangerous business. It could cost you your life. So therefore, you would often not find this information. And actually, sometimes you would find a place as other than it was actually, just to confuse the opposition. But this one has the right place of printing in Wittenberg. The publishers were Lucas Cranach and Christian Döring. They are both businessmen in Wittenberg. Lucas Cranach was also an artist. He had his own studio, a lot of people working for him, very gifted man. And he became what we could call also Luther's marketing manager and the brand manager. Branded Luther and his publications, his books, and the title pages. The printer was Melchior Lotter Jr. And we know it was finished by September 25th, shortly before the autumn mass in Leipzig, where new books were presented. So that's why it's called the September Testament. And the printer was print run was pretty large at the time, 3,000 copies. Some say 5,000, and most say 3,000 copies. And the price was a half a guilder. Well, that was cheap compared to the Gutenberg Bibles and to these German Bibles that had been printed before, but it equaled the weekly wage of a traveling carpenter. So if you think about that, if you compare that to the weekly wage of a carpenter today, you get some understanding about the cost of this for ordinary people. And it's was in a folio size. I have a replica here, so we can see it's quite a big book. I can't see myself in the camera now. Well, it doesn't matter much. So this edition of New Testament was actually the 19th to be printed in German, but the first to be translated from the Greek. So these 3,000 copies actually sold out very quickly. It was a sensation at the time. And actually before, while it was still in printing, Luther was revising his translation. And at the same time, he also started to translate the Old Testament with Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. So the second edition was printed in December 1522, about the same print run. And it included a number of revisions. And it's called, you probably guessed it now, it's called the December Testament. Yeah, Alex already covered this with the table of contents and Luther's reasons for not including all books on the same level, so to speak. So Erasmus was, Luther was translating from Erasmus's second edition of 1519, the Greek-Latin dialect, and from the Latin Vulgate. Here is the illustration of the first edition of 1516, a beautiful edition, as you can see, that is part of the museum's collection. So he translated from Greek to German, that's how we say. And both things seem simple enough, but it's a little bit more complex when it comes to, because what was German at the time? Germany at that time, Luther's time, didn't look like Germany today. Germany at that time looked like a puzzle of different smaller states, etc. And language-wise, it was also that way. So like I previously said, you would have two main divisions. You would have a Low German in the north, so in the lower areas, geographically speaking, above sea level, you would have Low German. And in the south, with the higher levels, geographically speaking, mountains, etc., you would have High German. And that High German reached quite north, but there was an area where it was kind of a little bit in the middle, and we could call that Middle German. And that is exactly where Saxon, you find Saxon, which is Luther's home ground. So when he translated into German, he tried to find a middle way to reach as many Germans as possible, you could say. And the German that he, and his main focus was ordinary people, to make it understandable to ordinary people. So the September Testament is famous for its illustrations. And there is 21 full-page illustrations in it, and they're all in the book of Revelation. which is a bit of ironic since Luther, as Alex pointed out, put the book of Revelation at the bottom of the list, so to speak, and didn't really trust it to be really reliable. But he actually came to change his opinion on that in his later years. But anyway, it has these beautiful illustrations, very also and also made to teach people about the content of the Apocalypse, the Revelation. They were made by Cranach in his studio, his workshop, but they were made on the model of Albert Dürer's famous series from the Apocalypse in 1498. And if we compare these, we easily see who was the most talented, and that was the older Dürer. It's not only famous for illustrations, it became infamous for it. And that is because of especially two illustrations, one of the Babylonian horn and one of the wild beast. And they became infamous for it because of that they were both depicted with the papal tiara, the papal crown on their heads. So this was obviously a very great provocation to the Pope and to the Catholic Church. The interesting thing is that one of the revisions from the September version to the December version is actually this, that you can see that the papal crown is cut down to more like a regular tiara. So, and that was at the instigation of Luther's main protector, so not to create more political religious opposition than necessary. Luther was very concerned with the pedagogical teaching, and this is also reflected in the layout of his New Testament. It's a one-column text, fairly large letters to be easy to be read, and then you would have chapter numbers, no verse numbers, because they were only invented 30 years later. And you would have scriptural cross references in the inner margin. In the outer margin, you would have the marginal notes commentary. And this particular part of the Bible has a lot of these commentaries because this is in Romans, in the third chapter of Romans, part of the Bible that had very great interest to Luther. So no translator operates in a vacuum. Every translator is a human being who reflects his or her beliefs and faith and theology. So what was Luther's main theological foundations? We can sum it up in three. Sola fide, sola gratia, sola scriptura. That is Latin. And the first means that salvation results from justification by faith alone, not from priestly absolution or works of penance. And sola gratia means that forgiveness is granted solely because of God's grace, not by the authority of priests and popes. And sola scriptura, that all doctrinal matters are to be confirmed by scripture only, and not by popes or church councils. But these were his three, you could say, main columns. And this was reflected, the first one, sola fide, was reflected famously in what Alex actually already covered in Romans 3:28, where he said, so halten wir nun dafür, dass der Mensch gerecht werde an des Gesetzeswerke, allein durch den Glauben. So, as Alex pointed out, he added the word allein, not part of the Greek text, but part of of Luther's understanding of what this text meant, which was a provocation to the church, and then resulted in Luther defending himself in his open letter on translating. Luther, in this New Testament, it's not always obvious why he chooses to translate in various ways. But there are four main ways he does it. The first is when he follows the Vulgate, the text of the Vulgate, and translates the Greek text the same way as the Vulgate does. And then, or he follows the Vulgate against the Greek text, or he follows the Vulgate in spite of Erasmus's correction of it. The second main way is that he follows the translation of Erasmus against the Vulgate. And this is the normal case where Erasmus deviates from the Vulgate. And then he follows Erasmus' comments against the Vulgate sometimes, even where Erasmus did not implement them himself in his own translation. And then he combines various suggestions to make his own translation. He translates freely, inspired by Erasmus's notes, maybe, or he translates wrongly, sometimes, from the Greek against both Erasmus and the Vulgate. But translation is a complex affair. It has to do with the source language, the target language, with understanding and interpretation, like Alex pointed out. So this is not something extraordinary, actually, because it's the work done by human being, and when it's only one being, that translation work is also more reflected that being's personality. And we also have to be aware. Here we see a copy of the 1519 edition of Erasmus's Testament. And we see the Greek text at the page to the right. We see the Greek text in the left column, and we see the Latin text in the right column. So this is what Luther had in front of him, his eyes. But then we have to remember that in the back of his head, he had the Latin Vulgate Bible, and also renderings from German Bibles. So we had, like I said, the German Bibles are almost more Latin than German, and the Vulgate was, of course, in Latin. And here in front of him, in two columns next to each other, he has also the Latin in Erasmus's translation, and then the Greek. And then we can add to this, like Alex pointed out, that he was a novice in Greek, but he was an expert in Latin. So now, no doubt, the Latin directly, indirectly influenced Luther a lot. As I said, he was very concerned with making it easy to read and handy to be used. And he was inherited two traditions: the medieval style, with the prefaces at the beginning of each book, and the biblical text in the middle of each page, surrounded by the glossa ordinara, that is the commentary of the church fathers and medieval theologians. But also the Renaissance ad fontes format, which meant that it was translated from the original languages, and while it would still be prefaces, it printed only the biblical text on each page. That comments appeared at the back of the book or in a separate volume. So Luther would combine these two into one handy, reader-friendly format. Martin Luther, he struggled a lot with translating. And he said that if God had wanted me to die thinking I was a clever fellow, he would not have got me into the business of translating the Bible. But he continued. Like I said, just as the September Testament had come off the press, he was already busy translating the Hebrew Bible into German. And now he is no longer in isolation up at Wartburg. So now he has a possibility also to go to the butcher and study the inside of animals in parts in the Bible that has to do with sacrifices, animal sacrifices, and description of those intestines and so. So you see, okay, what is this called in German? He would borrow the crown jewels to find right German names for various precious stones in the Bible. He would go to the pub to take in how ordinary people were talking around him, the words and language they used. And he would work with artists on details and illustrations, where he was very particular about that, what to include in illustrations and what not to include in illustrations. So any information that was not in the Bible, he was very against having it in these illustrations. When he was working with the Hebrew Bible, he had especially used a Hebrew Bible that you see up in the right corner. That copy, his own personal copy, can be found in the library in Berlin. He also used a Latin translation of the Hebrew Bible done by Santos Pagnino, published in 1528. And also in the same year, translation into German of the prophets by two radical reformers, Hetzer and Denk. And he would especially use that on some tough parts of the Hebrew text. And then last but not least, he as always, had the Vulgate. So this work continued throughout the 1520s. And he was also assisted by his friends in that work, because Luther was bogged down with work. And he was still a professor at university, so he did lectures there. He was also functioning as a priest. He always had many visitors. He was dragged into politics. He got married in 1525. He got children. And in addition to this, he also struggled with his health. So the translation of different books dragged on. And in the meantime, then business-minded printers or other reformers will take the opportunity to make Bibles with the translations that Luther had accomplished, together with translations from others. And the first complete Bible, this first composite Bible, was the Swedish Bible from 1529. And here is a picture of the 1531 edition from the museum collection, which was the first of this, and Luther's translation was adapted to the Swiss German dialect. And this Swedish Bible is just like the Luther Bible, still used in Switzerland today by the German-speaking population, and was actually a new edition just in 2007. But that was in the southern part of Germany, in Europe. If you go to the northern part, we have a Low German Luther Bible that is published half a year before Luther's own official edition in Wittenberg in High German. And it was instigated by Luther's very close friend and partner, you could say, Johannes Bugenhagen. We don't know if he translated it, but it's the only translation that was actually sanctioned by Luther himself. And we see here a picture of the title page from the of this first edition of this Bible from the museum collection. It's hand colored, as you can see, a very beautiful Bible, and the woodcuts were made by the artist Erhard Altdorfer, and it was printed by a printer called Ludwig Dietz in Lübeck, and we'll return to him later on. We can see a further illustrations of this beautiful Bible, really a gem in the museum collection. That brings us to the High German Luther Bible, 6 months later, printed, of course, in Wittenberg by Hans Luft, who will be the most important printer of Luther Bibles. And it was introduced exactly 12 years after the New Testament at the same trade fair in Leipzig in the beginning of October. And it contained 170 woodcuts from the workshop of the Cranach family, so a beautiful Bible also, as you can see. And the papal crown is back, both on the prostitute and on the wild beast. So if we look at this timeline of the High German editions of Luther's Bible, in the 12 years between 1522 and 1534, different parts of the Bible were published in sequence to bring them to market, to make them available to in not so costly editions. And then the complete Bible in 1534. But Luther continues to revise together with his associates. So in 1541, there's a revised Luther Bible. And then in 1545, it's the last Bible that was published in Luther's time, also a revision. It's called Letzte Hand, because it's the Bible, the last Bible that Luther himself put his hand on, sanction on. But an important revision came in 1546, the year that Luther died, but after he had died. And the man behind that was Luther's secretary, who would take Luther's additional revisional notes that have been made after the 1545 edition and put them into 1546 edition. And that is the one that actually should have become the Luther Bible for posterity, but it was the 1545 edition that became almost like a holy text to Germans for centuries. All these Bibles, all these works, was actually constituted a transformation of the whole publishing industry in Europe, from books for the few to books for the many, from books in Latin to books in the vernacular language for ordinary people to read, from the big and expensive to the small and inexpensive, and with elaborate title pages that were branding actually the writer or the translator, marketing, branding. So altogether, there were 430 editions of parts of the Bible or the complete Bible just in Luther's lifetime. And that constituted more than 1 million copies in his lifetime only. It has been calculated that every 10th household in Germany had his own Bible in 1533, while 30 years earlier, it was only every 43rd household. And actually, by 1546, the year Luther died, there was 1 copy per 2.5 households in Germany. That is really remarkable. This shaped and united the German language and was a starting point for translations in Protestant countries, and inspired Tyndale, and through Tyndale, the English Bible and the King James Bible, the most printed book in the world. And the Luther Bible is still the most widely used Bible in German, in the German-speaking world. And there was actually a new, very comprehensive revision in 2017, 500-year anniversary edition of the Reformation. And the Luther Bible is also part of the UNESCO World Heritage. A German author said about the importance of the Luther Bible for the German language that it's German literature's most important book. And it was the one that collected German together as a language. And as he said, and I'll just read through the last part, that it formed the German language into a unit and gave the Germans a common treasure of formulations, images, and turns of phrase that penetrated through all the pores and cracks of the language. From this point of view, it was fortunate that Luther mastered a vivid, flexible German that makes the later Bible translation seem all the flatter, he said. Lastly, now we will look at the influence that the Luther Bible had on the Nordic Bibles. We are, after all, the Nordic Bible Museum. It influenced heavily the Swedish Bible and the Danish Bible, and through them also the Finnish Bible and the Icelandic Bible and the Norwegian Bible. First and foremost in layout and format, with the prefaces and so on, but also with the language. This chart shows in this column the text that Luther translated from, was inspired by, and here we see Luther's versions, and then in the column to the right we see the Nordic language editions. And to put it simply, all the first New Testaments in the Nordic realm were translated partly from Luther, is German, and partly from the Latin and the Greek. It's a complex picture, like it usually is. And the same is also reflected in the Old Testament and the Bible. That is partly from the source languages and partly from Luther. But we have to bear in mind that also in the Nordic countries, all the academics, all the scholars, they were very well versed in Latin, and they also knew German well, but Hebrew and Greek, well, that was another matter. So they depended on the Latin, they dependent on the German. The Swedish Bible is a little bit further from Luther when it comes to language, while the Danish Bible is relatively closest, but it's also closest in proximity to Germany geographically and culturally. One way that we can see this influence is also in the title pages. The one to the left is from the Moses, the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, the 1523 translation of Luther. And to the right, we see the title page of the Swedish Vasa Bible, the first Nordic Bible, 1541. And if you look at it, we see that the second is a copy of the first, of the Luther Bible. And same also when we go to the Danish Bible. To the right, we have I failed to mention that the copy on the right here is a copy from the museum, a collection exhibition, the first Nordic Bible. And here to the right, we have also from the museum exhibition, the first edition in Danish, the Christian Third Bible. To the left, we have an illustration from a Bible that we already looked at, the Low German Bible that came 6 months before the official High German version of the Bible. You see, it's exactly the same title page illustration. And that is because when the Danish king wanted to have the Bible printed in Danish, he hired the same printer from Lübeck that had printed the Low German Bible, and he came up to Copenhagen with all the woodcuts from that Bible, his machines and his men, to print the Bible in Copenhagen. Lastly, we will see how Luther's Bible modeled how the divine name, the Tetragrammaton that we find in the Hebrew Bible, how it was rendered in the Nordic countries. In Luther's New Testament of 1522, he rendered it with had in the New Testament, where it quotes from the Old Testament in quotations that include the divine name. Rendered it had with small letters. In 1534, in his complete Bible, he did the same thing in New Testament, but he introduced had with capital letters, lower capital letters in the Old Testament. Then in his revisions in the late 1530s, he obviously found that, well, this was inconsequential. So he introduced had with capital letters in the New Testament, where he quotes from the Old Testament in places where that includes the Tetragrammaton. We see this reflected in both the Danish and the Swedish Bibles. The first Danish New Testament, 1524, says Herren with small letters in New Testament. And then in the Swedish in 1526, the same thing, Herren. But then in the complete Swedish Bible in 1541, we see Herren with capital letters, both in New Testament and in the Old Testament. And the same thing then 9 years later in Copenhagen with the Danish Herren with capital letters, both New Testament and the Old Testament. So I'll just sum it up in a few questions that reflects some myths and some beliefs about Luther and the Bible. Is it fair to say that Luther translated the New Testament from the Greek? Yes, but not only. Also from the Latin, in Erasmus's translation, and from the Latin Vulgate. Is it fair to say that Luther created the modern German language? No, he didn't create it, but he formed it. He collected it together, so to speak. Is it fair to say that it should be called the Luther Bible, as opposed to the Luther Melanchthon, the Bogenhagen, and so on Bible? Yes, because Luther was the driving force all the way. He was the driving force in it. Is it fair to say that he worked on his translation to his deathbed? Yes, he literally did. That he never made a dime from his writings? Yes, he never did. It was the printers that got rich. Is it fair to say that without Gutenberg, Luther would not have lived to translate the Bible? Yes. He would not have been able to live long enough to translate the Bible, and there would not have been a Reformation, because if his writings hadn't been spread quickly enough, he wouldn't have gathered enough support and momentum, and the church would have killed him off. Is it fair to say that the Luther is the most influential Bible translator of all time? Yes, along with Jerome of the Latin Vulgate. I'll just give you one recommendation for further study and enjoyment, and that is beautiful facsimile edition of the Luther Bible, and it's very inexpensive, of the 1534 first edition in color, and it comes with a booklet that gives a comprehensive history of the Luther Bible as a book by a German historian. And you can purchase this online at our museum shop at nobimu.com. And last but not least, at the museum itself, you can see in the permanent exhibition, you can see a very early 1551 complete edition of the Luther Bible, and also a 1662 Kurfish Bible, which is the Luther translation. And in the collection, as mentioned, we have a 1531 Swedish pre-Luther Bible, and a 1533 also then a Luther, extremely early Luther Bible. So please welcome.